For centuries, the British Empire ruled the world. It controlled the oceans, owned the trade routes, and commanded colonies across every single continent. At its absolute peak, 1 out of every 4 people on Earth lived under British rule. You've heard the saying, the sun never set on the British Empire, and it was true, because it was always shining on British land somewhere in the world. And yet, today, that empire is gone. No global colonies, no absolute power, no imperial dominance. So, what happened? This isn't the story of one war or one rebellion. This is the complete story of how the greatest empire in history collapsed, and why even unlimited power could not save it from its ultimate downfall. Let's dive in. How did a tiny island on the fringe of Europe build the largest empire in history? The answer isn't what you might think. Britain wasn't born an empire. It had no vast territories, no massive population, and it wasn't a land-based military juggernaut like France or Spain. So, what was its secret? It all boils down to 3 key advantages that Britain leveraged better than anyone else: its navy, its trade-focused mindset, and its revolutionary financial innovations. Let's dive into the first one: naval power. Being an island, Britain's survival depended on the sea. This forced them to develop a world-class navy, not just for defense, but for projection of power. While other European empires were busy fighting endless, costly wars for scraps of land on the continent, Britain looked outward, to the vast open oceans. Their strategy wasn't to conquer continents directly, but to control the highways of the sea. They understood that whoever controls the waves, controls the world. This brings us to the second point: a relentless focus on trade. Britain's goal wasn't just conquest for the sake of glory, it was conquest for profit. They fought for control of crucial trade routes, strategic ports, and resource-rich colonies. The British Empire was, in many ways, a massive commercial enterprise. Their merchants, backed by the might of the Royal Navy, sailed to every corner of the globe, establishing a trading network unlike any seen before. This created a powerful feedback loop. The Navy protected the merchants, and the wealth generated by the merchants funded an even bigger and better Navy. It was a cycle of unstoppable expansion. But how did they afford all of this? That's where the third advantage, financial innovation, comes in. Britain pioneered modern finance, the creation of the Bank of England, the development of a national debt system, and a sophisticated stock market allowed the government to raise enormous sums of money. They could fund their wars and their naval expansion on a scale their rivals could only dream of. This financial firepower gave them the endurance to outlast their enemies in long conflicts and to continuously invest in their imperial project. So, it wasn't about the size of their land or their army. It was a brilliant combination of sea power, a commercial mindset, and financial muscle. Britain essentially built a business, protected by the world's best security guards, and funded by the most advanced financial system on the planet. It was this unique trinity that allowed a small island nation to cast a shadow that stretched across the entire globe. What do you think was the most important factor? Let me know in the comments below. Ever wondered how a small island nation came to rule a quarter of the world? It wasn't just about planting flags. Britain's expansion was a masterclass in strategy. They used colonization, sure, but also powerful trading companies like the East India Company, which acted like a state within a state. When that wasn't enough, they used military force and clever political manipulation to get their way. India became the jewel in the crown, a vast source of wealth and manpower. Africa was carved up for its rich resources, while the Caribbean islands generated immense profits from sugar. Asia was prized for its huge markets. But here's the twist: Britain didn't always rule directly. Often they controlled economies, pulling the strings from afar. This informal empire was incredibly efficient, but it also laid the groundwork for future conflicts and exploitation. It's a complex and often dark history. If you found this interesting, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. Ever wondered how Britain, a small island nation, came to rule a quarter of the world? By the 19th century, the British Empire was a global superpower. Its influence stretched from the vast lands of India and Canada to the shores of Australia and across large parts of Africa and the Middle East. They weren't just collecting territories, they controlled key ports worldwide, creating a massive network for trade and naval power. This dominance turned London into the undisputed center of global finance. The British pound wasn't just another currency, it became the world's currency, the standard for international trade. So, Britain didn't just rule land, it ruled the entire global system. shaping the world economy in a way that had never been seen before. It was truly an empire on which the sun never set. Ever wonder why empires fall? A lot of it comes down to money. Take the British Empire, for example. On the surface, it was a global powerhouse, but behind the scenes, it was a massive financial drain. Think about it. They had to maintain the largest navy on the planet to protect their vast territories. They were constantly putting down revolts in colonies thousands of miles away. Plus, all those crucial trade routes needed constant protection. Over time, these costs just kept climbing. The colonies demanded more and more military support, which meant spending on the army and navy exploded. The administration to run it all became bloated and incredibly expensive. So while the British Empire looked fabulously wealthy from the outside, it was slowly bleeding money. It's a classic case of the costs of expansion eventually outweighing the profits. Ever wondered how Britain, a tiny island, managed to control a quarter of the world? The story we're often told is one of a civilizing mission, of progress and order. But that's not the whole picture. The truth is, empires aren't built on handshakes. They're built on force. And where there's force, there's always resistance. The colonies were never passive recipients of British rule. In India, people rose up in countless acts of defiance. In Ireland, the fight for freedom was a centuries-long struggle. Across Africa, warriors and communities fought fiercely to defend their lands and their way of life. Britain's power relied on the sword and the gun, but using force is a double-edged sword. It creates resentment, it sows hatred, and it builds enemies. And enemies have long memories. They wait for the moment the empire shows weakness, ready to reclaim what was taken. The story of empire isn't just about conquest, it's about the unyielding spirit of resistance. Thanks for watching. World War I, a war to end all wars. For Britain, it was a victory, but what a victory it was. It came at a price so staggering, it would reshape the nation and its global standing forever. When the armistice was signed in 1918, a wave of relief and celebration swept across the country. But beneath the surface, the foundations of the British Empire were cracking. Let's talk numbers, because they tell a truly sobering story. Over 700,000 British soldiers never came home. Millions more were wounded, both physically and mentally, carrying the scars of trench warfare for the rest of their lives. An entire generation of young men was decimated. This wasn't just a demographic loss. It was a deep, psychological wound that cut across every town and village in the land. And then there was the money. Wars are incredibly expensive, and World War I was on a scale never seen before. Britain poured its national treasure into the war effort. The government had to borrow, and borrow heavily. Before the war, Britain was the world's banker, a global creditor with vast overseas investments. By the time the guns fell silent, the country was drowning in debt. Its national debt had soared from around £650 million in 1914 to a staggering £7.4 billion by 1920. Where did this money come from? A huge chunk of it came from across the Atlantic, from the United States. This was a monumental shift. For the first time, the mighty British Empire was financially dependent on another nation. The pound sterling, once the undisputed king of global currency, was now looking over its shoulder at the American dollar. This financial shift marked the beginning of the end for Britain's global economic dominance. The empire itself, the source of so much British pride and power, was also showing signs of strain. While it actually expanded after the war, acquiring new territories from the defeated German and Ottoman empires, the will to rule was weakening. The war had been fought, in part, under the banner of self-determination. This idea didn't just apply to Europe, it resonated throughout the colonies. Nationalist movements in places like India and Ireland gained momentum. The immense sacrifice made by colonial troops during the war also led to louder calls for greater autonomy and even independence. The empire was bigger, but it was also more fragile. So, while the victory parades filled the streets, the reality was far more complex. Britain had won the war, but it had lost its economic supremacy, a generation of its people, and the unquestioned loyalty of its empire. The post-war years were a time of social unrest, economic hardship, and political change. The world had been turned upside down, and Britain, despite being on the winning side, was struggling to find its footing in this new, uncertain landscape. Have you ever wondered how empires fall? It's not always with a bang, but sometimes with the quiet clinking of coins changing hands. While Europe was engulfed in the flames of 2 world wars, something incredible was happening across the Atlantic. America was rising. The United States transformed from a regional player into a global industrial powerhouse. Think about it. While other nations were rebuilding, America was building factories, tanks, planes, you name it. The story really picks up during World War II. Britain, the empire on which the sun never set, was fighting for its very survival. They fought with incredible bravery, but the cost was staggering. To fund the war effort, Britain had to make some tough choices. They started selling off their gold reserves, then their overseas assets, piece by piece. Imagine a giant corporation forced to sell its most valuable branches just to stay afloat. That was the British Empire. Power, especially economic power, was shifting. The financial center of the world moved from London to New York. The US became the arsenal of democracy, supplying the Allies with the weapons and resources they needed to win. But this came at a price for Britain. By the end of the war, the country was essentially bankrupt. They had won the military victory, but the economic cost was immense. The empire, with all its global commitments, was a luxury they could no longer afford. The post-war world looked completely different. The British pound was no longer the dominant currency. The US dollar was king. Britain had to borrow heavily from the United States, further solidifying this new power dynamic. The war had finished what World War I had started, the slow, painful transfer of global dominance. It was the end of one era and the dawn of another. The British Empire didn't collapse overnight in a single battle. It was a gradual unwinding, a story written in ledgers and loan agreements. It's a fascinating and complex piece of history that shows how quickly the tides of power can turn. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're rediving into a question that has fascinated historians for decades. What really caused the fall of the British Empire? While many factors played a role, the story of its final collapse is deeply tied to the aftermath of World War II. Picture this. It's 1945. Britain has just emerged victorious from a brutal 6-year war. But this victory came at a staggering cost. The nation was financially exhausted, owing massive debts primarily to the United States. To rebuild, Britain needed American loans, but these loans didn't come for free. They came with some very specific and very tough conditions. The Americans insisted that Britain open up its markets to free trade. This meant dismantling the very system that had made the empire so profitable, the colonial trade advantages. For centuries, Britain had used its colonies as exclusive sources of raw materials and captive markets for its goods. Now, that was all supposed to end. Essentially, the price for Britain's economic survival was the beginning of the end for its imperial system. Faced with this choice, Britain accepted the terms. The dominoes were about to fall. The first, and most significant, domino was India. Often called the jewel in the crown, India was the absolute cornerstone of British imperial power. It provided immense revenue, a vast pool of military manpower, and was a symbol of Britain's global authority. But the tide of history was turning. In 1947, after years of struggle, India gained its independence. This single event wasn't just a loss of territory. It was a fatal blow to the entire imperial structure. Without India, the empire's financial foundation crumbled. The massive revenue stream that had propped up the system simply vanished. The British military lost access to the Indian army, a critical source of manpower that had policed the empire for generations. And with India gone, Britain's prestige and authority on the world stage were severely weakened. The loss of India created a chain reaction. Other colonies saw that independence was possible and intensified their own movements for freedom. Britain, now financially and militarily weaker, lacked the resources and the political will to hold on. One by one, from Africa to the Caribbean, colonies gained their independence. The empire that had once spanned the globe, on which the sun never set, was rapidly unraveling. So, while the seeds of decline were sown over many years, the economic devastation of World War II and the subsequent loss of India were the final, decisive blows. The cost of winning the war was, ironically, the empire itself. It's a powerful reminder of how quickly even the mightiest empires can fall when their foundations are shaken. Have you ever wondered what happens when the biggest empire in the world just fades away? For a long time, the saying went, the sun never sets on the British Empire. It was massive, spanning continents, controlling a quarter of the world's population. But then, it all started to unravel. So, how did this global superpower collapse? It wasn't a single event, like a final battle or a treaty. It was more like a slow, complicated crumbling. A good place to start is India. After World War II, Britain was exhausted and deeply in debt. Holding on to its vast territories became incredibly expensive. India, the jewel in the crown, was fighting for its independence, led by figures like Gandhi. When India finally gained its freedom in 1947, it sent a powerful message across the globe. Suddenly, the idea of independence wasn't just a dream, it was a reality. After India, the dominoes began to fall. One by one, colonies in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia started pushing for their own freedom. Sometimes, the handover was peaceful. Other times, it was violent and tragic. But the trend was unstoppable. So, what were the main drivers behind this collapse? First, there was massive overextension. The empire was simply too big and too diverse to manage effectively forever. The cost of controlling all these territories, especially with rising nationalist movements demanding self-rule, became a huge burden. Britain was still reeling from the economic devastation of 2 world wars. It simply couldn't afford its empire anymore. At the same time, the world was changing. The old colonial model was becoming unacceptable, and a new superpower was on the rise. The United States. America was now the dominant economic and military force, and it generally favored decolonization. So, the British Empire didn't fall in one dramatic moment. It faded. It was a combination of massive war debt, the unbearable cost of control, powerful nationalist movements, and a new world order dominated by America. Britain transformed from a global empire into a former empire, a nation finding its new place in a world it once ruled. It's a fascinating story of how even the mightiest powers can't last forever. For centuries, one empire stretched its influence across every continent. A power so vast that people said the sun never set on it. The British Empire. From the Americas to Asia, its flag flew, shaping the modern world in ways we still feel today. But history has a funny way of turning the tables. No empire, no matter how mighty, can last forever. The tides of power shift, new forces rise, and the costs of maintaining such a colossal system begin to add up. So, what happened? How did this global giant eventually crumble? The sun never set on the British Empire, until, one day, it did. This is the story of when thrones fall.